By such simple means, the Russian legation obtained regular statements of our army, which the Minister of War imagined to be only known to himself, since he had in his pocket the key belonging to the double lock of the desk in which they were kept. This unfortunate clerk was not the only one who afforded information to the Russian legation, although he contrived to explore for them the offices of the two ministers of war. There were other traitors involved in his perfidious proceedings. He forfeited his life for the act of treachery in which he was convicted, having been condemned to death by the criminal tribunal of the Department of the Seine. Had it not been for the ridiculous obstacles set up against me, I should have discovered this plan of corruption 6 months before, and perhaps Russia would not have set on foot so formidable an army as she was led to do on ascertaining the extent of our own armaments. Such, however, was the fatality of the times, that the Minister for Foreign Affairs pretended also to exercise the duties of Minister of Police. This discovery was rather a source of uneasiness to me than otherwise, as I foresaw all its consequences, and as it gave me a very poor opinion of the degree of prudence with which matters of the highest importance were conducted. I could not help reflecting that if the same importance had been attached to the object of penetrating the enemy's movements, such a course could not have failed to be attended with success. The proceedings on the trial effectually proved that the system of bribing in the War Departments in behalf of the Russian legation had been organized before the campaign of 1805 and was kept up during the wars which had sprung up since that period. This was assuredly an object deserving of the most serious consideration. The Emperor was highly displeased at the act of treachery discovered in one of his officers, and said to me on that occasion, while speaking of the Emperor of Russia's aide-de-camp, I had already warned the young man that if he continued to act that part, I could no longer admit him into my presence, and he gave me his word that he would abstain in future from such conduct. It was incumbent upon me either to believe or to refuse seeing him. The statements, however, have not furnished him with any very satisfactory result, meaning that the numbers borne upon them exceeded the reality. The Russian aide-de-camp had not yet crossed the frontier when the discovery was made. It was easy, by means of a telegraphic message, to procure his arrest at Mentz, but this course would have subjected him to too great a humiliation, because a criminal tribunal would infallibly have summoned him as evidence on the trial of the clerks in the War Department, and his character must have suffered in consequence of such an exposure. The Emperor approved of this forbearance, which was, however, lost upon the Russian officer. His expressions on the occasion were even of such a nature as to cause a regret that he should have been spared the disgrace of being held up to his fellow countrymen in a character that must have been injurious to his future prospects. Chapter 18. The facts I have just related took place in the month of March, 1812. The Emperor had gone to Compiègne, which he preferred to any other residence, owing to the facility it afforded him for exercise. Another reason for his preferring a residence far removed from Paris was that he was mostly alone, and therefore better able to attend to state affairs. He must have drawn up his plan of operations in the month of March, since he was staying at Compiègne when he was received from Berlin the ratification of the alliance between Prussia and France. The Russians were astonished at this treaty, having reckoned upon Prussia, though not at all upon Austria, which had but very recently entered into a treaty with us. These several alliances had the effect of placing the Emperor at the head of an immense army, composed of all the military states of Europe, excepting England, since it numbered Spanish and Portuguese soldiers in its ranks. If there ever was a circumstance in the whole course of his life in which he had to call the power of physical force in aid of the inspirations of the most elevated foresight, the present was assuredly the most favorable opportunity for doing so. Nothing, therefore, could be more rational than to take advantage of the times for the purpose of operating those changes in Europe which were so loudly called for. If the enterprise had been successful, the emperor would have been extolled far above the rest of mankind, because the pages of history could have presented no parallel for so immense an operation. All those who at a later period became his enemies would then have acted the parts of humble adulators. Fortune not having proved true to the object so recently, the theme of unbounded admiration, the most malignant attacks have embittered his fall. Previously to quitting Paris for the purpose of opening the campaign, the emperor had his son christened. The child being nearly 13 months old, he left Compiègne for Paris on the occasion of this ceremony, which was performed in the Church of Notre Dame towards the end of April 1812. It was of the most brilliant description. The emperor and empress repaired to the church in great pomp, accompanied by the cortege, which is customary in all public ceremonies, and were received at the threshold of the cathedral by the archbishop and all his clergy. The cathedral was filled with spectators who never ceased to cry, "Long live the emperor and empress!" from the moment of their entering the church until they quitted it. Their majesties proceeded from thence to the Hôtel de Ville, where the city of Paris had prepared a dinner according to a very old custom, which has been strictly adhered to on the occasion of the christening of any heirs to the throne. The city of Paris deserved the highest praise for the splendor of the feast, the sumptuousness of the service, and the profusion of every article of luxury. It was a day of general feasting, the city having caused provisions to be distributed to the people. The fountains were filled with wine, and dancing was kept up the whole night. The large court of the Hôtel de Ville had been transformed into a spacious apartment by means of a strong framework. This work supported a floor on a level with the windows of the first story of the hotel, which had been converted into doors for the purpose of communicating with the side apartments. It would have been difficult to bring together a more brilliant company than the numerous assemblage of citizens. The emperor eagerly sought every opportunity of mixing and conversing with them. The empress, though still very young, bore the fatigues of this imposing ceremony. With her wonted kindness, she had need of great patience, as on making the round of the immense assemblage of company, she had to repeat over and over again, in all its variations, the little court phrase which applies to all and to everything. To this she added expressions which could not fail to win her the hearts of those who might have otherwise formed an unfavorable judgment of her, owing to an air of cold reserve, which was to be ascribed to the timidity natural to her youth and to her excessive modesty. Her voice was no sooner heard than she drew all hearts after her. Her success in France was entirely her own work, for I can solemnly attest that the ministry never employed any underhand means of securing applause on her appearances in public. Whenever she went to the theater or to any ceremony, the superintendence of the administration was limited to the object of preventing any infringement of the strict rules of propriety. Nothing farther was ever attempted. When, for instance, I knew that she intended visiting a theater, I took the precaution of engaging all the boxes facing her own, besides others where the company might have incommoded her by fixing their eyes upon her. I then sent the tickets of those boxes to respectable families who were glad of the opportunity to occupy them. I acted in the same manner with respect to the company in the gallery on the nights of the empress going to the theater. I never adopted any precautions to secure the applause of the pit. The Empress Marie Louise had the practice on her appearance in public to make 3 such graceful curtsies, and the last was invariably preceded by long and loud applause. She took care to save me any trouble on the subject. After the ceremony of the christening of the King of Rome, the emperor went to reside at St. Cloud and remained there till his departure for the campaign of 1812. Previously to quitting France, he disposed of every public business which required his presence. This was his practice whenever he undertook a journey. He generally had private conversation with each minister for the purpose of giving his special instructions when he was desirous of any business being carried on without farther correspondence with him. He never overlooked the smallest details. They all appeared to him deserving of his attention, and when he came to the last week of his stay, he replied to all outstanding cases referred to him by his ministers. This is what he called clearing his closet, because he then solved a variety of questions which had been long proposed to him and were yet unanswered. On the occasion of his departure, he conversed with me relating to every subject to which he was desirous I should attend during his absence. This was a general instruction on his part, and by no means so severe as it was supposed to be by men whose whole life has been engaged in representing him as a tyrant, devoid of every sense of justice and of all kindly feelings. And yet these were the qualities for which he was most conspicuous. He felt particularly beholden to anyone who would afford him an opportunity of doing an act of justice. And as he was never wearied of granting favors, so there could be no hesitation in soliciting them. I do not pretend to deny that many acts of his administration have been vexatious to individuals and have been ruinous to some families. There are few, however, respecting which I might not fully acquit him from blame, as all the severe measures which he resorted to under peculiar circumstances had been recommended and urged beforehand in official reports addressed to him by persons in whom he had confided, for making the truth known to him and for proposing whatever remedies were most calculated to remove the subjects of complaint. This was especially the duty of the Council of State, to which he referred every matter connected with the law of the land, the administrative departments, or the law of nations. He had moreover given to a few individuals the permission to write to him confidentially on the general state of public opinion, as well as respecting the impression created by certain acts of his government. It was impossible to adopt greater precautions for avoiding whatever might give it the appearance of having a tendency to tyrannize over the people, and there is reason to believe that if those who were honored with his confidence had shown a faithful attachment to his service, no one would have had to complain of the slightest injury. Nothing, however, is more common than to meet with men who are apprehensive of telling unpleasant truths, or who can only tell them in an unpleasant manner. Thus it is that, failing in the object for which they were placed in communication with the head of the government, they have generally wandered into metaphysical subtitles, instead of letting him know those facts which appear to be no secret to anyone but himself. They failed to discover that when the emperor called for information, it behooved them fearlessly to force their way through intrigue, envy, courtiers, and every species of adulation, and make the truth known in the very heart of palaces, from whence it seems to be forever discarded. The emperor was probably aware of this when he took so much pains to be correctly informed, and I am fully persuaded that if a baneful influence had not succeeded in keeping at a distance all those who could have been to service of him, he would have been found at all times surrounded by the most enlightened men that France could boast of, who were constantly represented to him as his enemies, and who by the unwearied efforts of courtiers were eventually looked upon with an evil eye. That fatal influence had removed from his person the individuals who were most likely to offer useful suggestions, and I must openly declare that the emperor never entertained any unfriendly intention towards those faithful servants, which did not originate in some false report, the author of which is much more liable to blame for the consequences to which it led. In the instructions given to me by the emperor before his departure, I was particularly enjoined to be mild and considerate towards everyone. He observed to me that there never came any good out of creating a feeling of hostility, and that in the ministry of police, more than in any other, it was necessary to act with gentleness. He repeatedly cautioned me to avoid every arbitrary arrest, and to have always justice on my side in every measure I might adopt. He spoke to me in this conversation respecting the war he was compelled to undertake, complained of not having been faithfully served, and of being driven to engage in a contest with Russia alone in the present year in order not to have to fight in the next against Austria and Prussia. He said that he now had a numerous army fully adequate to the enterprise, whilst he might have to contend with inferior numbers on his side if fresh enemies should rise next year against him. He deeply deplored the confidence he had placed in those sentiments which had induced him to make the peace at Tilsit, and often repeated these words: "Whoever could have saved me from this war would have rendered me an essential service. Now we have it. We must extricate ourselves to the best of our power." He hoped to employ to his own army for no longer time than the first campaign, and to open the second with a Polish army which he would have raised on his way through the extensive provinces of Poland. Chapter 19. Following up the views he had entertained in 1807, it was the Emperor's intention to give a mighty impulse to the national character in Poland, towards which country he had forwarded all the resources of the French arsenals, which were emptied of their contents. Nevertheless, this immense quantity of warlike stores was unavailing to arrest the downfall of our unhappy country. Very little skill was displayed in carrying the Emperor's orders into effect. What he had squandered away in a few weeks, the execution of all his mighty conceptions was entrusted to men who fancied they had done everything that was required of them. If they wrote a letter to one person, who was directed to write to another, and so on, without any farther trouble being taken to promote the success of the cause. He meditated to establish in the very heart of Poland the power he was to display in the present campaign. He had anticipated all the wants of his army, and had accordingly caused immense purchases to be made of all kinds of provisions, which were to be transported to that country. The same care was bestowed upon the clothing of the troops. He had neglected none of the duties devolving upon him as commander-in-chief of the army. If one half of the arrangements he had prescribed had been attended to, the army would have met with every comfort, and even found itself in a state of abundance at every 20 leagues of country, instead of experiencing, as it did, the severest privations. It was the Emperor's wish to take M. de Talleyrand in his suite for the purpose of giving to Poland the mighty impulse which he meditated. He recollected the effective services rendered by that diplomatist at Warsaw in 1806 and 1807, and reserved for him the same part on the present occasion. Mr. de Talleyrand had even accepted the offer made to him. The Emperor, who foresaw that some intrigue would be set on foot, had enjoined him not to mention the subject, an injunction which was implicitly obeyed, but he gave to some bankers in Vienna certain orders which the latter allowed to transpire. These orders, which might perhaps relate to mere private affairs, were spoken of in the world as a commencement of stock jobbing, and reported as such by our minister at the court of Vienna. The Emperor felt much displeased at this rage for speculating. He mentioned it to me, saying that he was at a loss to comprehend such over-eagerness for money, and still more so that the diplomatist should have thrown out any hint on a matter respecting which he had recommended the strictest secrecy. He could no longer, therefore, place any confidence in him, and must renounce the idea of availing himself of his services. This resolution, independently of the important reasons which had influenced it, was probably encouraged by the Minister for Foreign Affairs. These two statesmen were not on the most friendly terms. M. de Bassano had even declared that if M. de Talleyrand were employed, he would be under the necessity of declining to follow the Emperor, as he felt satisfied that every exertion would be made to defeat all the measures he might think proper to adopt, an impression which was not altogether mistaken, since M. de Talleyrand never had the credit of being disposed to praise the successes of his former friends. The Emperor, after having regulated by an official order the manner in which he required the business of government to be conducted during his absence, assembled an extraordinary council of ministers, at which the Arch-Chancellor and Mr. de Talleyrand were present. This happened at the beginning of May. He stated his intention to proceed that very night on his expedition, which terminated in a manner the more deplorable as, in the event of his success, it would have been without a parallel in the pages of history. The emperor stated at this council the uneasiness which he felt at the possibility the English would attempt during his absence to carry the Pope away from Savona and take him back to Rome for the purpose of creating an insurrection in Italy. He expressed his intention of removing him to Paris, but the members of the council whom he consulted were of opinion that he ought certainly to be removed from Savona, but not brought to Paris. The emperor accordingly decided he should be removed to Fontainebleau, adding that he would give orders on the subject, but that I was in the meanwhile to make the necessary arrangements to enable the Holy Father to travel with every comfort, but to avoid the noise and display of a journey which would afford so much food for conjecture. He dwelt very little upon his intended expedition, and merely said that it was prepared on a mighty scale and offered many difficulties which he nevertheless expected to overcome. He kept the council sitting for some time and took his departure for Dresden during the night. The empress accompanied him on the journey, having expressed a desire of seeing her father, who repaired to Dresden, as well as the king of Prussia, and the Prince Royal, his eldest son. The capital, Saxony, afforded a second representation of the meeting at Erfurt. Each of the guests was unsparing in expressions of cordiality and regard for the emperor, which could never have been taken for their parting farewell. The emperor remained a fortnight at Dresden, a valuable time taken from the short period of the fine season he had to spare from his campaign. He felt it necessary to give this proof of his desire to show the sense he entertained of the attentions of his allies. They were all fully aware of the emperor's real object in opening the campaign, and none were found to hesitate a moment in following his fortunes. After that delay, the emperor took his departure for the banks of the lower Vistula, which he crossed at Thorn, and from thence proceeded to visit Danzig, and overtook his army, then in full march towards the Niemen. Previously to quitting Dresden, he had given the Archbishop of Mechlin, who followed him as his almoner, the appointment of ambassador to the Polish government residing at Warsaw, to which city the prelate repaired with powers from the emperor, and as the organ of whatever demand he might have to make to that government during the campaign. Upon him therefore devolved at Warsaw the part which had originally been intended for M. de Talleyrand, who had been left by the emperor at Paris. M. de Bassano followed him in the character of Minister for Foreign Affairs, and M. Daru as Minister Secretary of State. The Empress left Dresden, and in order to indulge some time longer in the enjoyment of her father's company, she proceeded to Prague, where she remained a fortnight on her way back to Paris. I now return to the narrative of the affairs of Spain. After raising the siege of Badajoz, the army of Portugal protected the refitting of that place, and the repairs which it fortified and stood in need of. As soon as those objects were accomplished, it took up a position in the valley of the Tagus, with its headquarters at Naval Morale, and in readiness to move either upon Badajoz or Ciudad Rodrigo, according to the point the enemy might select for his attack. Ciudad Rodrigo was protected from that moment by the army of the north of Spain, which occupied Salamanca with one of its divisions. The army of Portugal was thus placed between the armies of the north and of the south, and prepared to connect its operations with either as circumstances might require. Towards the month of August, the English army crossed the Tagus, only leaving on the frontiers of the province of Alentejo the 2nd Division under the orders of General Hill, and it took up a position in the vicinity of Almeida and Ciudad Rodrigo with its light division on the other side of the river Agueda. Rivers and rumors were afloat that Lord Wellington intended laying siege to Ciudad Rodrigo, and that ammunition was collecting. For that purpose, Marmont pushed some troops forward to the Col de Banos and placed the greater part of his army between that col and the Tagus, establishing his own headquarters at Plasencia, so as to receive early intimation of any occurrence and to act with rapidity on an emergency. The month of August and a great part of September were employed in these movements. Ciudad Rodrigo was in want of provisions, and the army of the north of Spain was making arrangements to throw a considerable supply into the place under the protection of a corps of 12,000 men, but their numbers were inadequate to the attempt of approaching the English army with so large a convoy. It was necessary, therefore, to obtain the cooperation of the army of Portugal. Marmont put it in motion for the purpose of supporting the advance of his corps and of covering the convoy of supplies. A simultaneous combination was given to those movements. The army of Portugal debouched from the Col de Banos and advanced to Ciudad Rodrigo by Tamames and Tiburon, whilst the convoy, protected by the army of the north, proceeded by the road of San Munoz. The whole corps of the northern army marched forward with the convoy. As the enemy did not oppose any forces to its advance, the infantry of the army of Portugal remained in echelons on the road which it had taken, and the cavalry alone proceeded towards Ciudad Rodrigo. The object of this operation having been effected, another movement remained to be accomplished, which was to reconnoiter if the enemy had made any preparations for the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo. The hostile army not having been assembled, a strong reconnoitering would have had the effect of scouring the country and of obtaining a knowledge of its intentions. The cavalry of the army of the north was ordered to move on the road from Almeida to Especia, whilst that of Portugal marched on El Bodon. The infantry of the former having advanced as far as Ciudad Rodrigo, Marmont requested General Dorsen to supply the cavalry by one of his divisions. Our troops had scarcely quitted Ciudad Rodrigo when a strong brigade of English cavalry was descried on the heights of El Bodon, besides 2 brigades of infantry. They were, however, separated from each other and could not act in concert. Marmont ordered General Montbrun to overthrow them and take possession of all the heights with his cavalry, a movement which was immediately carried into execution. Repeated charges were made upon the infantry, but all in vain, for it required in good order after having resisted the renewed attempts made against it. And the 2 brigades succeeded in forming a junction at Fuente Quinaldo, where some entrenchments had been thrown up. The division of infantry of the army of the north had remained at a considerable distance behind, and either neglected to execute or had not received the orders that General Dorsen was expected to have issued. It gave way at the moment when, being supported by Marmont's cavalry, it ought to have afforded the means of taking possession of Fuente Quinaldo. The general rendezvous fixed upon by the English army. Night came on in the meanwhile and prevented our troops from taking advantage of the critical position of that army. Having found it thus disunited, Marmont ordered all his troops to join him. But it was impossible to collect them until the following night, and the English army had also brought up its scattered divisions and taken a commanding position. Marmont was desirous of availing himself of the reinforcement of the northern army to offer battle to the English army, but it retreated in the night towards Sabugal. All he could do the next morning was to pursue it. The distance of several leagues with the English were already beyond the reach of our troops. The object of the junction had been accomplished, and a farther delay in the same position was no longer of any advantage. The 2 armies therefore resumed their cantonments. After having placed Ciudad Rodrigo in the best state of defense, the Duke of Ragusa, feeling no longer uneasy respecting the fate of Ciudad Rodrigo, and being compelled to alter his position in order to subsist his army, made his troops penetrate into the valley of the Tagus, stationed his headquarters at Talavera, and occupied Toledo, which was given up to him upon an order from the emperor to that effect. Such, however, was in those unhappy times the spirit of infatuation exhibited by persons most interested in the operations of the army, that before King Joseph would deliver up that province to Marmont, and whilst the army which protected it, and alone enabled him to remain quiet in Madrid, was perishing with hunger, he ordered that the supplies of provisions which had been collected there with the utmost difficulty should be disposed of. The troops of the army of Portugal were scarcely returned from the expedition to Ciudad Rodrigo and established in the fresh cantonments, when the Duke of Ragusa received orders to send forward a strong detachment to afford support in case of need to Marshal Suchet, who was making preparations for attacking Valencia. This detachment was to open a communication for itself with the army of Aragon and form a junction with it, if it should be deemed necessary. The order was as follows: the Emperor desires me to inform you, Monsieur le Maréchal, that the capture of Valencia is an object of paramount importance at this moment. It is the Emperor's wish that you should send off a corps of troops which, after it shall have joined the forces about to be detached by the king from the army of the center, is to advance upon Valencia in order to support the army of Marshal Suchet until that city shall have fallen into his hands. You will cause this movement to be effected without delay in conjunction with His Majesty the King of Spain, and inform me of what shall have taken place on this subject. It has been intimated to us that the sick of the English army amount to 20,000 men, and that they have not that number of men left under arms, so that they are unable to undertake any operation. It is therefore the Emperor's wish that 12,000 men, infantry, cavalry, and sappers should immediately advance to Valencia. That you should also detach 300 or 400 men to follow in the rear of that corps, and that you, Monsieur le Marechal, should hold yourself in readiness to assist in the capture of Valencia. When this city shall have fallen into our possession, Portugal will offer a very feeble resistance, because when the favorable season shall have returned, the army of Portugal will have increased by 25,000 men from the army of the south, and by 15,000 men of the corps of General Wright, thus amounting, when united, to upwards of 80,000 men. In such a state of things, you would receive orders to move upon Elvas and take possession of the whole province of Alemtejo, whilst the army of the north would advance towards the river Coa with an army of 40,000 men. The pontoon train of Badajoz would serve for throwing bridges over the Tagus. The enemy would be wholly unable to oppose so strong a force, which offers every chance of success without the smallest risk of failure. It is therefore an object of primary importance to take possession of Valencia. We were masters of one of the suburbs on the 6th of November. There is reason to hope that the city will be captured in December, an event which will put it in your power to reach Elvas in the course of the month of January. Send me your opinion respecting this plan of operations, in order that after the news shall have arrived of the capture of Valencia, the Emperor may give you positive instructions for your guidance. The Prince of Wagram and Neuchâtel, Major General Alexander Berthier. It will not fail to be remarked that this letter of the 21st November could not reach Marmont until December. Berthier calculated upon the capture of Valencia in December. Of what use, then, could be the detachment which Marmont was directed to send off? The answer may be readily anticipated. It proved of no service to Suchet, tended to weaken Marmont, and placed Ciudad Rodrigo in imminent danger. I have heard the Emperor deeply lament the idea of ordering off this detachment. The order, however, was of a positive nature. The Duke of Ragusa sent 2 divisions of infantry and 1 of cavalry under the command of General Montbrun to accomplish the object in view, but the weak resistance offered by General Blake rendered superfluous his assistance, and the operation of General Montbrun went no farther than his advancing to Alicante and returning in the direction of Toledo. The movement in question took place in the beginning of December. On the 13th of December, 1811, the Emperor communicated to the Duke of Ragusa the fresh arrangements he had made, the main object of which was to enable him, in the case of need, to withdraw some of the troops from Spain, and especially all the guards who were stationed in the northern provinces. According to these fresh arrangements, the marshal was to bring all his forces to the valley of Tormes, and his headquarters to Valladolid or Salamanca. The provinces of Talavera, Avila, Valladolid, Leon, the Asturias, Benevent, Astorga, etc. were to be included in the district to be occupied by the army. The movements were to be executed without delay, and Marmont's army was to be increased by the 7th Division, then at Salamanca, and the 8th, which was stationed in the Asturias. On the 5th of January, 1812, Marmont moved forward all the divisions of the army of Portugal to take up positions in the respective provinces assigned to them, and the troops marched, each corps in its prescribed direction, the whole of the materiel and of the artillery preceded by the Guadarrama. General Montbrun's division was carrying on its operations in La Mancha. He arrived at Valladolid on the 8th of January and bestowed all his care to those objects which the new plan of operations rendered necessary, and to the throwing of fresh supplies into Ciudad Rodrigo, as well as relieving the garrison, which later occurrence was to take place as soon as the army should have united. On the 15th, he received a letter from Salamanca, dated the 13th, which informed him that the hostile army had taken up a position in advance of the Agueda, had blockaded blockaded Ciudad Rodrigo and was preparing to lay siege to it. He immediately sent orders in all directions for the different columns to converge from their positions and repair to Salamanca, calculating that the greater part of the army would be collected there by the 25th and that he might consequently offer battle to the English army under the walls of Ciudad Rodrigo. He quitted Valladolid on the 18th, arrived on the 20th at Fuente el Famo, where he received the news of the capture of Ciudad Rodrigo, of which the English army obtained possession on the 18th. Thus it happened that this place, which had defended itself for 5 weeks against the French army, which was in a condition to resist any attack, and the strength of which had been augmented by a half moon, well calculated to project the defense for a week longer, was compelled to surrender at the expiration of 5 days from the time of its being first invested. This occurrence deranged every combination. Marmont had only to take up a defensive position which might enable him to collect all his troops on the first indication of an attack from the enemy. The troops that were on the left bank of the Tagus being enabled to act on the right bank under cover of the fortifications of Almaraz and of the fort of Miraves, which secured the means of debouching on the plateau and protected the roads, succeeded in preventing the enemy from bringing their guns to bear upon Almaraz. The greater part of the troops extended from Avila to Valladolid to Zamora. Astorga was occupied, and a division was stationed at the pass of the Asturias in the province of Leon. The Duke of Ragusa was unremittingly engaged in the erection of lasting fortifications at Salamanca by means of 3 large convents, which were turned into 3 strong forts, and which, according to the system adopted, rendered it necessary to carry on a regular attack for several successive days. These fortifications were at the head of the position of the army of Portugal and protected its magazines and depots. Such was the state of affairs when the English determined upon following up their offensive operations and advancing against Badajoz. Accordingly, after placing Ciudad Rodrigo in a state of defense, they effected a movement beyond the Tagus, leaving 2 divisions only on the Agueda. Marmont entertained a hope of arresting their progress by the position he had taken up. He was in communication with the left bank of the Tagus. His means of crossing the river were in readiness, and his provisions of all kinds collected at one point. He expected that he might debouch in time to effect a junction with the army of the south and either protect Badajoz from a siege or cause it to be raised if it had already commenced. The emperor was of opinion that this system indicated too much pusillanimity, and he gave the most imperative orders to operate a diversion in the north of Portugal with the view of drawing off the main part of the English army to that quarter. The dispatch transmitted by the Major General was worded as follows: Paris, 18th February, 1812. His Majesty disapproves of the direction you are giving to the war. You have a superiority over the enemy, and instead of striking the first blow, you suffer him to be beforehand with you. General Hill's advance against the army of the south with 15,000 men is the most fortunate circumstance that could possibly happen to you. That army is sufficiently well organized and strong enough not to have anything to apprehend from the English army, even if the latter should amount to 4 or 5 divisions acting in concert. The enemy is at present under the impression that you are about to lay siege to Ciudad Rodrigo, and his right is made to extend towards General Hill so as to enable the latter to join him by forced marches, when he will give battle to you with the whole army united. If you attempt to recover possession of Ciudad Rodrigo, it is therefore the duty of the Duke of Dalmatia to keep him in check with 20,000 men and prevent his effecting that movement, and in the event of General Hill's crossing the Tagus, to follow him or advance in the Alentejo. You have a duplicate of the letter which the Emperor desired I should write to the Duke of Dalmatia on the 10th instant in reference to the request he made that you would rather order some troops to the south. You should have asked him, on the contrary, Monsieur le Maréchal, to send a large body of troops to the Guadiana in order to detain General Hill in the south and prevent his forming a junction with Lord Wellington. The English have too just a sense of French honor not to be fully aware that the success obtained by the capture of Ciudad Rodrigo may eventually turn to the disadvantage, and that instead of improving the condition of the English, the occupation of Ciudad Rodrigo imposes upon the latter the necessity of defending it. They leave the choice of the field of battle. Where is this? I can't believe it. Oh, there it is. They leave the choice of the field of battle at our option, since you compel them to hasten to the relief of that city and to fight in a position so far removed from the sea. I can do no more than repeat the Emperor's orders. Establish your headquarters at Salamanca. Use every activity in fortifying that town. Collect in it a fresh besieging train for the purpose of placing it in a state of defense, and every species of ammunition. Let the English be annoyed by daily attacks. Send forward 2 strong advance guards, the one to threaten Ciudad Rodrigo, the other Almeida. Assume a menacing attitude in every other part of the Portuguese frontier. Send out detachments to devastate some of the villages. Exert every means, in short, for keeping the enemy upon the qui-vive. Attend to the repair of the roads leading to Oporto and Almeida, and station your army in the neighborhood of Toro and Benevent. There are even certain parts of the province of Avila which might supply you with resources. By assuming this position, which is as simple in itself as it is formidable to an enemy, you secure the object of giving rest to your troops, of forming magazines, and by means of easy but well combined operations which enable your advanced posts to come every day to close fighting with the English, you have the advantage over them and prevent their watching your movements. It is not for you, therefore, Monsieur le Duc, to give assistance to the army of the south by spreading your forces over a wide extent of country. When you proceed to take the command of your army, it had just suffered a severe check by its retreat from Portugal. That country had been devastated. The enemy's hospitals and magazines were at Lisbon. Your troops were harassed, dispirited by forced marches, without artillery, without any field equipment. Badajoz had resisted a lengthened attack. A battle in the south had not had the effect of raising the siege. What course ought you then to have adopted? Ought you to have moved towards Almeida for the purpose of threatening Lisbon? Assuredly not, since your army had neither artillery nor field equipment, and was broken down by fatigue. Had you been in that position, the enemy would not have been deceived by the threat. He would have suffered you to approach as far as Coimbra, would have taken Badajoz, and then advanced to attack you. You acted therefore judiciously at that time. You advanced in all haste to the relief of Badajoz. The enemy had the start of you, and the art of war required that you should not shrink on that occasion. The siege was raised, and the enemy retreated into Portugal. All this was as it should be. Your position at this moment, Monsieur le Duc, is plain and simple, and requires very little combination of mind to guide you. Place your troops in such a manner that in 4 marches they may be collected and grouped around Salamanca, where you will have your own headquarters. Let your orders and arrangements give the enemy to understand that your heavy artillery is on its way to Salamanca, and that you are forming large magazines in that place. If Wellington takes the road to Badajoz, do not molest him, but collect your army immediately and march at once to Almeida. Push your parties on towards Coimbra, and rest assured that Wellington will be soon to get after you. Write to the Duke of Dalmatia and urge the king to do the same in order to induce that marshal to execute the imperative instructions that she has received from me to move forward a corps of 20,000 men and thereby force General Hill to remain on the left bank of the Tagus. Give up then, Monsieur le Maréchal, all idea of moving to the south and advance at once upon Portugal. If Lord Wellington should commit the error of proceeding upon the left bank of the Tagus, Profit of the time, take it up in collecting your troops and attend to the regular and systematic organization of the north. Let the fortifications of Salamanca be carried on night and day. Bring up heavy pieces of artillery, cause the besieging train to be repaired, and magazines of the stores and provisions to be got in readiness. You will not fail to perceive, Monsieur le Marechal, that by following these instructions and carrying them into effect with becoming activity, you will keep the enemy in check by being the first to attack, by only attending to the army of the south, which has no need of your assistance, since it consists of 80,000 of the best troops in Europe, by bestowing attention to countries not under your command and abandoning the Asturias to those provinces which really concern you. The injurious consequences of a battle would be felt all over Spain. A check received by the army of the south would compel it to retreat to Madrid or Valencia, and would not therefore be so serious in its results. I repeat that you are at liberty to retain the advantage over Lord Wellington by placing your headquarters at Salamanca, occupying that position with a large force, and pushing strong reconnoitering parties to the passes. I could only state what I have already explained to you on the subject, that Badajoz were merely watched by 2 or 3 English divisions. The Duke of Dalmatia might easily raise the blockade, but Lord Wellington, being thus weakened, you would be enabled to penetrate into the interior of Portugal, which movement would afford much more effectual relief to Badajoz than any other operation. I am issuing directions that you may be supplied with everything requisite to enable you to complete your artillery and place Salamanca in a state of defense. The Emperor supposes you will quit Salamanca 24 hours after the receipt of this letter, unless any unexpected event should occur, that you will direct an advance guard to occupy the passes leading to Ciudad Rodrigo and Almeida, that you will keep under your immediate orders a whole division at least, and will recall the cavalry and infantry which are with the division on the Tagus. I particularly recommend that you should collect your cavalry, which is not over numerous, and which is nevertheless indispensable for your operations. Marshal Marmont had a very different notion of the manner in which the war was to be conducted. He transmitted them to the Major General about the same time that the latter was expediting to him the dispatch just laid before the reader. I published the letter of this marshal as containing a faithful account of the state of affairs in the peninsula. Valladolid, 23rd February 1812, to the Prince of Neuchatel. Monseigneur, I am not yet informed whether His Majesty will have deigned graciously to concede the request I had the honor of submitting to your Highness, the object of which was to obtain the Emperor's permission that I should act under him in the campaign about to commence. Whatever may be his determination, I nevertheless deem it to be my duty to make known to him, at a moment when he is about to proceed to a distant country, what is the situation of affairs in this part of Spain. In conformity with the arrangements laid down by His Majesty, the army of Portugal has no longer the means of fulfilling the task assigned to it, and I should deem myself highly culpable were I to disguise the truth at this moment. The frontier is considerably weakened, owing, in the first place, to the departure of the troops, which were recalled in consequence of the capture of Ciudad Rodrigo, having enabled the enemy to penetrate into the heart of Castile, and undertaking an offensive movement, and in the second place to the immense extent of country which the army is under the necessity of occupying, the effect of which must always be to throw delay and difficulties in the way of its again forming a junction, whereas it was lately united in a compact body and ready to act in any direction. The 7 divisions composing it will amount to about 45,000 infantry, when the regiments which are announced to be on their way shall have joined the main army. It requires a corps of at least 5,000 men to occupy the fortified points and the line of communication, which it is necessary to keep up. A light force is indispensable for the purpose of watching the Esla and of protecting it against the army of Galicia, which would evidently advance to Benefit and Astorga in the event of any offensive movement on the part of the English. Supposing, therefore, that the whole army were united between the Douro and the Tormes, its strength could not exceed 34,000 men, whilst the enemy has it now in his power to bring forward an army of upwards of 60,000 men, one half of them English, well equipped and provided with everything. And yet how great are the chances that the divisions of the Tagus are in the rear, that it has been found impossible to rally them in sufficient time, and that they will be separated from the main army during the most important moments of the campaign. The mass of our united forces would not then amount to more than 25,000 men. His Majesty no doubt conjectures that in this case the Army of the North will send 2 divisions to the support of the Army of Portugal. But what certainty has the Emperor that in the present state of things those troops will be enabled to make a rapid march and arrive in time? The enemy assumes the offensive. His antagonist prepares his means of defense. The latter, who is to act hypothetically, quietly waits the course of events and allows a valuable time to elapse without any good effect. The enemy advances to meet me. I collect my troops with great precision and method. I know within a day the moment when the greater part may be drawn up in line, the precise period at which the remainder will be in communication with my troops, and with this state of things before me, I determine either to act or to postpone my operations. But it is impossible for me to rely upon such calculations, except in the case of troops purely and exclusively under my own orders. With respect to those over which I have no control, what delays, uncertainty, and lost time must I not be prepared for? I give intimation of the enemy's advance and solicit assistance. I am answered by remarks upon my application. My letter is delayed in its course, owing to the communications being obstructed in this country. The answer and my rejoinder to it will encounter the like difficulties on the way, and the enemies will, in the interval, come up with me. Nevertheless, how will it be possible for me, even beforehand, to make reasonable calculations upon the movement of troops whose strength and position are equally unknown to me, when I am ignorant of the situation of the country, or of the want of troops which is felt? I can only reason of events upon a consideration of the forces under my own orders, and as, however, I can accept the battle by receiving the assistance of troops which are not at my disposal, but which are nevertheless enumerated as forming part of the force I am too opposed to the enemy, I find myself in a false position, and am wholly unable to adopt any measure with due method and a proper knowledge of facts, if it be considered how great is the foresight required in Spain for executing the most trifling operations. No doubt will be entertained of the necessity of issuing beforehand a variety of preliminary orders, without which all movements of a rapid kind are out of the question. Thus it happens that the troops of the North, being in no way connected with me, although absolutely indispensable to enable me to fight a battle, the success of all my operations depends upon the greater or lesser degree of foresight and activity on the part of another commanding officer. It is therefore quite possible that I should be able to answer for the result of any event. But it is not enough to consider the aspect of affairs with respect to our northern defense. We must not overlook what the protection of the South appears to require. If Lord Wellington should carry 6 divisions to the left bank of the Tagus, the Duke of Dalmatia will stand in need of a powerful cooperation. If in this case the Army of the North should not furnish any troops for the purpose of relieving a part of the Army of Portugal in some of the positions which it will then have to evacuate for a time, but the retention of which by our forces is of importance to the security of the country, to the protection of Galicia, and to watching the movement of the 2 hostile divisions which would be stationed on the equator, and would no doubt make some offensive demonstrations. If I say the Army of the North should not come to its assistance, the Army of Portugal would not be in adequate strength to send forward a suitable detachment, and battle horse must infallibly surrender. Unquestionably, the Army of the North must receive orders before it can attempt a movement founded upon hypothetical data, and will also require sufficient time to be set in motion. If we confine ourselves to mere proposals or negotiations, we might waste in idle discussions a time which would be irrevocably lost. I am fully justified in drawing this conclusion. The Army of Portugal is at this moment the principal force in Spain. To her belongs the duty of protecting it from any English enterprise. It cannot maneuver without resting points, without fortified places, fortresses, têtes du pont, etc. This can only be obtained by its being provided with all the material of an artillery. And I am unable to supply either field pieces or ammunition, whereas the military depots of the Northern Army have all these in abundance. I may ask for a portion of them. They will be promised to me, but eventually nothing will be sent to meet my wants. Having discussed the question in a military point of view, I must shortly advert to the administrative department. The country assigned to the Army of Portugal is productive of resources estimated at 1/3 of those possessed by the 5 military governments. The Army of Portugal is far more numerous than the Northern Army. The country which it occupies is as yet unsubdued. Nothing can be procured except by coercive means, and the troops belonging to the Army of the North appear to have intentionally carried off all its resources at the moment of evacuating it. The other governments, although overrun by guerrillas, are still held in submission and pay the contributions levied upon them without rendering it necessary to recur to compulsory measures. The condition of the two armies, therefore, is widely dissimilar, and as everything ought to tend to the same object, as all are the Emperor's soldiers, and the exertions of all should concur to the success of our operations in general, it is not fair and just that the resources of all those governments should be regularly apportioned to the wants of each army. And yet I am at a loss to discover how we can secure this object, unless the authorities should center in a single chief. It will no doubt be found that I have clearly demonstrated the necessity for an effectual defensive warfare in the North, that the general of the Army of Portugal should always have under his orders the troops and territory belonging to the Northern Army, since these troops are called upon to fight in conjunction with the Army of Portugal, and the resources of that territory are to be partly assigned to their support. I now turn to what concerns the south of Spain. It is a part of the duties of the Army of Portugal to support the Army of the South, to watch Badajoz and cover Madrid. It is requisite for this purpose that a corps of sufficient strength should occupy the valley of the Tagus. This corps, however, will be unable to subsist or to prepare resources for other troops following in the same direction in order to support it, unless it be in possession of a fruitful territory, which can be no other than the district belonging to the Army of the Center. No other town in the valley of the Tagus can offer adequate resources or means of subsistence. Nevertheless, the only country occupied by the Army of Portugal on the banks of the Tagus is a desert, which is productive of no resources of any kind for men or horses, whilst the authorities of Madrid exhibit nothing but hatred and animosity towards it. The Central Army, which is inconsiderable, retains for its individual use a territory more fertile and extensive than what has been assigned to the whole Army of Portugal. The resources of this valley cannot be rendered available for wanted troops, and we encounter every species of resistance when we attempt to derive from it our means of subsistence. Nevertheless, if the borders of the Tagus should eventually be evacuated in consequence of the prevailing scarcity, no one in Madrid would have the candor to appreciate the true motives of such a measure, and all would join in accusing the Army of Portugal of leaving that capital uncovered. It is in vain to conceal that there exists on the part of the Spanish government a degree of bitterness and animosity towards the French, of which no expressions can adequately convey an idea. The disorder prevailing in Madrid is a sight of the most revolting description. If the supplies improvidently squandered away in that city had been husbanded for the Army of Portugal, the troops on the border of the Tagus would luxuriate in abundance and be amply provided for a long time to come. 22,000 rations are daily consumed in Madrid, where there are not 3,000 soldiers. This is owing to the waste occasioned by everyone being allowed to give or take away, except those whose services entitle them to a preference. I go farther and broadly assert that it is even considered a crime to draw off those supplies which the Army of the Center is unable to consume. It certainly does not appear inconsistent that when persons have been carrying on for the last 2 years a regular system of deceiving the king, and are daily arming and clothing soldiers who at the end of 48 hours are found to join the ranks of our enemies, and when they thus seem to have established a regular mode of recruiting for the corps that incessantly annoy us, They should likewise endeavor to prepare means of subsistence for them at our expense. The only road of communication between the left of the army of Portugal and the remainder of that army runs through the province of Segovia, and the movements of troops and of convoys cannot be unattended with difficulties because, although the country through which it runs is very fertile in resources, the authorities in the army of the center refuse to adopt any measure for the purpose of securing the means of subsistence of those troops. If it were possible to relieve the army of Portugal from the duty of advancing to the assistance of the south and of covering Madrid, it might derive great benefit from concentrating itself in Old Castile. It would, in that case, have no more difficulties to contend with. If, on the contrary, it is expected to perform that double duty, it can only do so by occupying the valley of the Tagus, which furnishes it with none of the resources requisite for its subsistence, for maneuvering or preparing everything to meet the wants of the troops which will necessarily be sent thither, unless it should take possession of the whole district reserved for the army of the center, including the capital. That territory ought to subsist the troops which at present occupy it, in order that the army, when it shall advance against the enemy, may not be compelled to leave anyone behind, but should draw from it all the assistance which it requires for keeping up its communications. That army claims, above all things, to be freed from the obstacles constantly raised by a government which is really opposed to the success of French arms. Whatever may be the king's good intentions, he appears inadequate to contend against the self-interest and passions of those who surround him. It also appears that up to this moment he has been wholly unable to arrest the disorders constantly breaking out of Madrid, or the anarchy pervading the army of the center. There may exist high political reasons for the king's residing in Madrid, but there are many more important ones, and affecting the success of the French arms, which would appear to recommend his selecting a different residence. For in fact, either the king acts the part of a general and is the commander of his armies, in which case he should be in the midst of his troops, ascertaining their wants, provide and be responsible for everything, or he is a perfect stranger to every operation. And then it is equally conducive to his personal quiet and to the greater freedom of those operations that he should remove from the very theater of them and from positions which are resting points for the movements of the army.